So here we are, 2 weeks since the celebration of Easter. I don't know about you, but I feel like it could just as easily have been 2 months ago or yesterday. It might be easy for us to lose sight of both the urgency and the desperation of those disciples on the road in the story this morning. The road to Emmaus starts on that same day. That is the day the women found the tomb empty, the day of resurrection. This is an Easter story. And not just a season of Easter story, it is an Easter day story. But it's not the story of Easter morning. This is not Mary's fearful grief turned to trembling joy. This is not the bright, clear dawn. This is a story of Easter evening, when these disciples have heard about the women's vision, but have not seen anything themselves. The sun is setting on their last glimmer of hope. Are they going back home, or just leaving the city, getting away from the crowds, the authorities? The gospel writer doesn't tell us why. But in any case, they are walking away from this place of Jesus' death. But they are also walking away from his resurrection, a story they just can't find it in their hearts to believe. And so they find themselves trudging along this dusty road. The 7 miles from Jerusalem must have felt so long that day. And then a seeming stranger comes up alongside them. He asks them what they've been talking about, and something in the way he asks makes them stop in their tracks. They stood still, looking sad. It's almost as if being faced with having to explain the whole thing to someone else, their grief overwhelms them. Can you imagine? It would be like someone coming over to you at the grocery store and asking, "Why are you wearing that mask?" How could you possibly not know? How could you be unaware of this huge trauma, this event that has reshaped what we thought our lives were going to be? But what if there was something about this stranger, some unexplained warmth, that opened up space for you, not only to explain a global pandemic to them, but to tell how it has been for you? But we had hoped. We had hoped for our high schoolers and college students to be at their graduations. We had hoped our children would still be in school with their friends. We had hoped that our parents would not be isolated and lonely. We had hoped to go on our vacation. We had hoped our grandmother would not die alone. We had hoped to be together with our community. The resurrection has already happened. The women have proclaimed it. Jesus is appearing to his disciples. But here on the road, he does not show up in all his glory. He comes as a fellow traveler on the journey, giving space for their story of lament, even though he knows that new life is already beginning from it. He invites in their telling of what they had longed for, what they had lost. The disciples' experience of hope and pain are not glossed over in the resurrection. I imagine that many of you are familiar with the nonprofit organization StoryCorps. The premise is simple. They record interviews between two people, one of whom asks the other about their life. The range of stories is really astonishing. And sometimes when I'm preparing a sermon, I go and listen to a handful, hearing what others have lived through, how they've changed and grown. This week, though, I was particularly struck by the essence of StoryCorps itself. Their founder, Dave Isay, says that people carry within them amazing stories. All you have to do, he says, is ask them about their lives and listen. He recognized this truth that people's stories matter, that listening to another is a sacred act. StoryCorps' mission is to preserve and share humanity's stories in service of creating a more just and compassionate world. Justice and compassion by sharing stories, by giving one another space to fully inhabit their own experience, to tell what their life has been like for them from the inside. By asking people to be vulnerable and open themselves up. By listening with respect and honoring the dignity of each human being. Our stories matter. Jesus makes room for the disciples' own experience of his trial and death, for the hope the women brought from the tomb, and for their confusion when they didn't see him. Then he reframes the story, placing it in the larger framework of God's saving story throughout human history. Jesus weaves their story and his story into the Israelites' exodus from slavery to freedom, into the call that God has long issued through the prophets for people to turn their hearts to God and care for their neighbor, into the promise that God always brings life from what we think is dead. I wonder if this is the part that made their hearts burn within them. If they remembered that no matter how devastated or lonely they felt, they were still called to offer hospitality to strangers, to open their homes and hearts, to make space for another. Having shared their experience, having been heard, and having opened themselves to Jesus' telling of the story, they then act with justice and compassion. Through the sacred stories, they are reminded that this is who they are. This story could have gone differently in so many ways. Jesus could have shown up in the first place and announced, "It's me." When they arrived at the house, Jesus could have told them he needed a place to stay for the night. They certainly could not have refused him then. But Jesus the Christ comes alongside them on their journey. He asks them about their lives, and he listens. He lets them invite him into deeper intimacy. He does not and will not force the vulnerability that is required to encounter resurrection. There are so many things that we had hoped. Some of our losses are big, huge life and death losses. And some we write off as trivial. We hold them up to someone else's loss and decide ours are too small to count. But they aren't. They are part of your story, part of the sacred story. Be vulnerable enough to tell another person something true about your experience. Ask someone about their life and listen. Tell me your story. I had hoped to get to know you all in person. Call me or send me an email. What has been hard? What losses have you experienced? What hopes seem to have been dashed? I'm going to ask our tech team now to put my contact information into the comments box. It will also be up again on the screen at the end of the service. Sharing these stories opens the way to transformation. In both the telling and the listening, if we are honest, we meet one another in our common humanity. The experience changes us, and while we may still feel sad or discouraged, our hearts might just be cracked open enough to invite in the new life of the resurrection. As our world changes in light of this global trauma, let us reshape it in the ways of justice and compassion. Let's come alongside one another and make space for these stories as we journey this road together.